Welcome everybody to linuxacademy.com. My name is Terry, and in this course we continue our preparation for the Linux Foundation Certified System Administrator exam. In this video, what we're going to be talking about is we're going to be working with groups. So in the past, you are probably familiar with user accounts. If not, we have a video on creating and managing user accounts. But user accounts define ownership based on two things. Based on the owner of the file that creates it. So in other words, if I am the root user and I create a file, I also own that file. And then by default, I also belong to a group that may have permissions for a file or directory as well. And those groups are defined in a file called etc group. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So if we change to our etc directory and we cat out the group file, and you would likely have to be root or run the command as sudo. And if you don't know what sudo is, just log in as root for right now when you're following along. And these commands are the same whether you're running Debian-based distributions like Ubuntu or RPM-based distributions like Red Hat or CentOS. We're going to be running the same commands for the same files. So if we cat the group file, we'll see that these are all the groups that currently exist on the system and their associated GIDs or group IDs. Now, the structure or format of this is the group name, the GID, and members of the group. So in this case, the members of the group are Ubuntu for the plug dev group, and there's no members for the staffing group, games, or users group. By default, when you add a user group is created. So when we created the user called user, it actually created a user group and it was assigned the GID or group ID of 1001. Now there are two ways to add a new group, and they both function the same way. It's either add group or group add. So we can add group test1 and we can group add test2. Now if we cat out the group command, we should see test1 and test2, which have equally been added automatically to the group file, and they have new GIDs. Now I can add an account to any of the groups if I want to by adding the name to the end of the line. So if I want to be sure that my user account belongs to a particular group, then I can add it to that group file. So for example, if I edit the group file, I can scroll down and I can make sure that my user account is added to test1 and test2. So now any file that is created with group permissions for test1 and test2, I can assume those exact permissions for the files and directories because I'm a member of the groups test1 and test2. So what does that mean? So let's log out of the root user. We are now going to log in as the user that we've added to the test1 and test2 groups. So let's do that on our Linux Academy server, keeping in mind that if you're following along at home, please use your Linux Academy lab server. We happen to be using Ubuntu for this, but you could equally use CentOS. It doesn't really make any difference. You could also use a local virtual machine in VirtualBox, VMware, Vagrant, etc. These commands will work exactly the same regardless of the distribution. So in my user group, if I create a file called test.txt, we'll see that that test.txt is owned by the user and the group user, because by default I'm the member of the user group and anything that I create is going to have group ownership. So really Linux uses groups as a way to organize users, and it's usually for a collection of accounts as a security measure. So control of group membership, as we looked at, is administered through that group file, and it shows the list of groups and members. So every user has the default or primary group, which in this case is user. And when I log in, that group membership is set for the primary group. And that means when I launch or create a program or file, the file and the running program will be associated with my current group membership, in this case user. However, I can access other files and other groups as long as I'm also a member of that group and the access permissions are set appropriately. If I want to run programs or create files in a different group, however, I need to run the new group command to switch my current group. So for example, if I wanted to create a file that was owned by group test1, I would do new group test1. So we see that there's a password here. So by default, there's going to be a password created for any group so that when we switch groups, we can actually change our permissions to that new group. In this case, we haven't set a password, so we don't know what that password is. So we'll get an invalid argument. So if I want to change to either test1 or test2, I'd have to know the password. So what I want to do is I want to go back into my root account and I want to set a group password for test1, which I'll set as something that I can remember. And I also want to set it for group 2. Once I've set those passwords, then what I'll want to do is I'll want to log back in as my user account and clear the screen, and we see that our test.txt again is used and owned by user name and user group. So if I want to create something that's under the test1 group, I do new group, test1. I put in the password that I created earlier, which will switch me to that group. And when I get switched to that group, if I do an echo another test to test2.txt, then you'll see that that user continues to own the file, but the group test1, which I'm a member of, and I provided a password for, now owns that particular group from a file system perspective. So now that I've entered the new group command, it's important to note that any files that I now create are going to be associated with the test1 group rather than my primary group. I can also change my entire group by doing the chgroup command. So for example, if I wanted to change my group to change group test2 to the file test.test2.txt, so I can change the group as long as I'm a member of the test2 group. Now when I look at that file, now the test2 group is owned from a group perspective by the test2 group user. So this is how I can manage what my system allows me to be in terms of ownership and membership is in the etc group file. I can add myself after I've added a group, after I've set a group password, then I can control the groups that I create files and launch processes from. So for group management, that's all there is to it. My name is Terry for Linux Academy.